Hello there and welcome to Tuesday in Parliament. Coming up in the next half hour, the government promises a more integrated approach to tracks and trains and an overhaul of the railways. Ministers are told a report on community integration shouldn't be used as a stick to beat minority communities. And what would make you put down that glass of wine? Peers think it's time to put calorie labels on bottles of booze.
Experiments I've seen show that if people are aware of the amount of calories they're drinking, they'll drink up to 50% less than they plan to otherwise.
But first, the Transport Secretary has set out his plans to overhaul the way that England's railway network is run. Chris Grayling wants to start bringing back together the operation of tracks and trains. Mr Grayling wants each rail franchise to be run by a joint management team, including representatives from both the train operating company and Network Rail. Each franchise will be run by one team, but the franchise owners and Network Rail will continue to exist separately. The first new joint management teams will come into operation when the South Eastern and the East Midlands franchises are relet in 2018. Called to the Commons by Labour, he said he wanted to improve services for travellers.
These reforms will set the railway on a firmer footing for the future. We can and we will make sure our network plays its part, Mr Speaker, in making this country a country that works for everyone. I will be bringing forward a new strategy for our railways with more detail on what I'm setting out today, Mr Speaker, in due course.
The last time the Tories privatised the rail tracks, it resulted in a series of fatal accidents that led to the creation of Network Rail in the first place. Now the Secretary of State wants to start us on a slippery slope back to the bad old days of rail track, where profit-chasing companies are entrusted with the safety-critical role of being responsible for our infrastructure. Has the Secretary of State not learned the lessons of rail track, or is he simply choosing to ignore them, and why does he expect it to be different this time? It is time for our railways to be run under public ownership in the public interest as an integrated national asset in public hands with affordable fares for all and long-term investment in the railway network. Sadly, today's announcement will take us further away from that than ever, but an incoming Labour government will redress as a matter of urgency.
Well, unfortunately, Mr Speaker, there isn't an imminent Labour government anyway, and the trouble is, with the party opposite, they always just want to turn the clock back. They want to turn the clock back to the days, Mr Speaker, of British Rail and unions having beer and sandwiches in number 10. We want to modernise the railways, we want to make them work better, and the point about this isn't about privatisation. I'm not privatising Network Rail, I'm creating teams on the ground with the same incentives to work together in the interest of the passenger.
The Secretary of State's right to acknowledge the problems with the rail network, but he shouldn't do this through further privatisation. There is higher passenger satisfaction and reliability in Scotland than any other network in the UK, but Scotland could do better. Will he agree to devolve power over Network Rail to the Scottish Parliament?
The point the Honourable Gentleman has missed, he's just described progress in Scotland. Scotland is the one place where we've got a working alliance of the kind that I'm talking about. So what he's describing is a step on the road to the model I want to create across the railway, which he says builds passenger satisfaction.
A joined-up approach could bring benefits and has been called for on many occasions by the Transport Select Committee, amongst others. But in the specific model that he is now advocating, how would safety be protected? And could this be the beginning of a potentially highly expensive fragmentation of the system?
Very good.
You see, that the opposite is the case, Mr Speaker. This is not about fragmentation, it's about joining up. As she will know, we have teams on the ground around the railway, some looking after the tracks, some looking after the trains, sometimes working together well, sometimes not. By creating a structure that shapes teams on the ground, and that involves decentralisation within Network Rail of the kind Nicholas Shaw recommended, the kind of partnerships that Sir Roy McNulty recommended, and I think that takes us to the place that she's talked about in the past of a more joined-up railway that does a better job for the customer.
Isn't this the Minister that's got a bit of form? In a previous job, he wrecked the prison system, and now he's got the job at Transport, and he's about to cause havoc there as well.
Does he share my hope that this might stop the buck passing between train operating companies and Network Rail, something that many of my constituents north of the river on the Thameslink line have suffered on a daily basis, and something I drew to his attention yesterday.
Brenda's absolutely right, and I make no pretence there are some genuine problems on our railways at the moment. They are mostly a problem of intensive use, of dramatic increases in passenger numbers, beyond anything that was envisaged even 10 years ago. So we do have to deliver change and improvement. That partly comes through capacity improvements, and a lot of money is being spent on the Thameslink route right now. It also comes through just better performance on a day-to-day basis.
The Community Secretary has told MPs that too many UK politicians have refused to tackle integration problems as they feared being called a racist. Sajid Javid was answering an urgent question on a government-commissioned review on integration. Dame Louise Casey concluded in her report that segregation and social exclusion are at worrying levels and are fueling inequality in some areas of Britain. She said women in some communities are denied even their basic rights as British residents, and she accused public bodies of ignoring or condoning divisive or harmful religious practices for fear of being called racist. Among her recommendations were that immigrants could take an oath of integration with British values and society, with school children taught British values. Sajid Javid set out the government's initial response to the report.
I've seen for myself the enormous contribution that immigrants and their families make to British life, all without giving up their unique cultural identities. But I've also seen, with my own eyes, the other side of the equation. For too long, too many people in this country have been living parallel lives, refusing to integrate and failing to embrace the shared values that make Britain great. And for too long, too many politicians in this country have refused to deal with the problem. They've ducked the issue for fear of being called a racist, failing the very people that they are supposed to be helping, and I will not allow this to continue.
Does the Secretary of State agree with Louise Casey that speaking English is key to integration? And will he agree to reverse the cuts which have been made to the funds available for courses teaching English as a second language? Does the Secretary of State have a view on the recommendations to promote British values in all communities, especially those values of tolerance and respect for others, and which would support equality on grounds of sex, sexuality, race and religion? Given that many of the recommendations are challenging, some may be controversial, will he have a programme to consult with elected councils and the different communities in those areas most impacted by the recommendations?
He will know that this is an independent report. It is not a statement of government policy. Naturally, the government would want to take the right amount of time to look at each of the findings of the report, and certainly the recommendations that Dame Louise has made. The honourable gentleman also asked about the importance of English, and that is one of the central mechanisms of the report, making sure that every community in Britain can speak English. I remember when I was about 8 or 9 years old, going with my mother when she had to visit the GP and acting as the interpreter for her. And many years later, I'm pleased to say that she learnt English and now she speaks it very well, and it has transformed her life. And I think not just for her, but it's great news for British society when more and more people that are sent here can speak English. So I know from personal experience the difference that could make.
One of the issues that was highlighted by the chair of the Select Committee is that of speaking English, and one of the most concerning areas of the report is how women in some communities are denied equal rights and opportunities. We are constantly urging people who suffer sexual abuse, violence, to speak out. You cannot speak out if you cannot speak English. If you cannot speak English, you cannot even ring 999. And yet the Casey report finds that DCLG spent more money promoting the Cornish language between 2011 and 2013 than it did English.
The Minister said that wasn't the case. The government spent £780,000 on the Cornish language and £11 million on English. Well, then it was over to backbench MPs.
I welcome all efforts to improve integration in the UK, and this is not the first study to find problems in this area. But I am concerned that there is no real understanding in this report of the simple truth that integration is a two-way street, and it should definitely not be used, as it so often is, as a stick with which to beat the minority communities of Britain.
I agree with the Secretary of State that for too long we have had a soft, wrong-headed attitude towards integration which has led to segregated communities up and down this country. I know he has already been asked about faith schools. Can I ask him to spend some more time looking at the report, because I share its concern that faith schools further isolate young children? And does he agree with me that this report deserves a serious and determined response?
Ending austerity, I believe, is the best thing this government could do to tackle social exclusion and to promote integration. Will he challenge the toxic rhetoric that pits groups in our society against one another? Will he look to Scotland to see how the strategies we are implementing are giving opportunities for people to share experiences? Will he reverse the damaging cuts to ESOL, as other members have mentioned? And will he refuse to accept the offensive suggestion that we require an integration oath?
Secretary of State.
It's a shame, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Honourable Lady has to be so party political about this. And for once she can't act in a more mature fashion. When she and the SNP have something useful to say, I will respond.
The Justice Secretary, Liz Truss, has faced renewed criticism over the time it took her to come to the defence of the 3 High Court judges who ruled that Parliament must have a say in triggering Brexit. That decision was criticised by MPs and some newspapers, with one, the Daily Mail, saying the judges were the enemies of the people. The Supreme Court is now hearing the government's appeal against that ruling. After calls for Liz Truss to condemn the attacks on the judges, it took nearly 2 days for her to release a statement defending the independence of the judiciary as the foundation upon which our rule of law is built.
After the press attacks on the judiciary, it took the Justice Secretary nearly 48 hours to release a statement. The former Lord Chief Justice, Lord Judge, said of this statement, "I think it was a little too late, and I think it's quite a lot too little." Yeah. Does she agree with Lord Judge? And if so, will she now take the opportunity to apologise?
Yes, very good, yeah.
It is not the job of the government or the Lord Chancellor to police headlines. The process is working absolutely as it should. People have a right to bring a case to court. The government has the right to defend its position in the court. The judiciary are independent and impartial, and the press can scrutinise the process within the law.
As we sit here today in this Parliament, just across Parliament Square, the Supreme Court is sitting with 11 Supreme Court justices. Does she not agree with me? Does this whole House not agree with me that the integrity of the Supreme Court and the justices should not be impugned?
Yeah. Well, I completely agree with my honourable friend. As I said last month, the Supreme Court justices are people of great integrity and impartiality.
In recent years, it's become commonplace for some members on the benches opposite to deprecate the judges of the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights simply for doing their job. Does she agree with me? Does she agree with me that such scant respect for the rule of law has encouraged the climate in which a major tabloid, which I believe some people call a newspaper, think it's appropriate to describe justices of our own Supreme Court as enemies of the people?
The independence of the judiciary is a vital part of our rule of law. But as my honourable friend has just said, what I think is important here in the UK is that it's British courts making those decisions, and that's precisely what we're going to achieve.
The President of the Supreme Court, Lord Neuberger, said at the beginning of the Article 50 appeal, "This appeal is concerned with legal issues, and as judges, our duty is to consider those issues impartially and to decide the case according to law. That is what we shall do." So does the Lord Chancellor agree with me that had she done her duty and spoken out at the time to defend the judiciary, those words would not have been necessary?
I frequently make it clear that the independence of the judiciary is a vital part of our constitution and our freedoms. But I also think it's absolutely right that the President of the Supreme Court, who has absolute integrity and impartiality, should make that case as well.
An independent judiciary and a free press are 2 pillars of a free society. And while we may not always like how each acts, we should be proud of and protect those freedoms.
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. We can be incredibly proud in this country of our independent judiciary. It's the cornerstone of the rule of law. It supports our commerce and trade. But we also have a robust free press, which is vitally important in making sure we have a free society.
You're watching Tuesday in Parliament with me, Alicia McCarthy. Now, is a GP who sees 15 patients in a day productive? And what about a surgeon who performs 10 operations in a week? Economists accept that it's difficult to measure productivity in the NHS, but the Office for Budget Responsibility has nevertheless concluded that growth in healthcare productivity has been slower than in the economy as a whole. A Laws Committee is investigating the future of the NHS and has been questioning senior health officials about how to make health professionals more efficient.
The OBR's analysis of how productivity has grown, particularly since 1997 to 2013, we saw an average of 0.9%, which is incredibly small, despite unprecedented levels of spending on health for part of that period. I think both of you would agree that productivity, and Professor Whitty has just mentioned it in his previous answer, is going to be fundamental to actually balancing the books in terms of what we spend and what we actually deliver. Why is it so low? What can be done to actually improve it? And why are there such variations in productivity around the healthcare system?
Why is it so low? Well, it's a much debated question. I'm not going to try and give you a sort of pat answer because, of course, there have been long treaties written on this subject. But clearly key to it is the relationship of health and technology. As you well know, what you see in most sectors of the economy is technology is one of the biggest drivers of productivity and then reduced cost. Health has a very different relationship with technology. Most technologies wonderfully both prolong life and allow us to treat diseases we have never been able to treat before, but they don't save money. And so why is health behind other sectors? I think that is probably at the root cause of it.
Well, there are two things, if I might interrupt. I mean, first of all the healthcare providers over the period since '97 have had access to the same technologies, and yet their levels of productivity have varied enormously, and the new dashboards are actually demonstrating that really quite vividly.
Dashboards are used by some NHS bodies to assess performance on a range of measures.
I think actually we've already stolen my answer. I think the transparency around this in terms of the data and the dashboards available is probably the single most important thing we can do in that area. And what we need to do is promote a culture in which health providers are looking at who is best in class and asking themselves what do they do in exactly the same way as you see in most sectors of the economy.
With masterly understatement, the OBR say that measuring medical productivity is not straightforward, which is clearly true. But I have to say, in this area, I think that the medical profession is its own worst enemy. And there are many leaders of the medical profession around the table here. My plea to the medical profession firmly would be that this is something they should take seriously, because currently they do not in reality. The incentives are not stacked up along actually trying to improve productivity in the system. They're stacked up along trying to prolong life, which is a very important thing to do, but the two need to be kept firmly in balance.
What are the barriers for the medical profession not taking it up, and how would you break these barriers?
Well, I think it's quite interesting in the sense that I think the medical profession has walked itself into a place which is incredibly efficient in terms of single disease management of conditions, which is what's led to many of the remarkable advances we've seen. But firstly, that doesn't deal very well with multimorbidity, which it is actually quite inefficient at dealing with as a result. The second problem is that the medical profession has got itself hung up, I think, on longevity rather than quality of life measures, and longevity rather than efficiency measures. And if you make those bits of the system as important in medical training all the way through the system, I do think we could change it incrementally really quite a long way. If we wish to make the NHS sustainable, there are broadly two ways you can do that, which is increase the amount of money going into a system is one approach, but the other is whatever quantum is given by the public to actually make the system more efficient. And actually the data to do that and the incentives to use that are currently missing.
Peers have renewed their calls for a minimum price per unit of alcohol to tackle problem drinking. The Scottish Government is already attempting to bring in the policy in Scotland, but the Scottish Whisky Association is fighting the move and has applied to appeal in the UK Supreme Court. There's been a lengthy legal challenge over the policy, which would set a minimum unit price of 50p in Scotland. In the Lords, one peer highlighted findings from a recent review by Public Health England on the consequences of alcohol abuse, and he urged the government at Westminster to act.
Is she aware that the report indicates that we now have over 1 million people a year going into hospital due to alcohol-related illnesses of one sort or another, and that this report now indicates that alcohol is the biggest killer of males between 15 and 49? And that it's time that we really do need to start taking some action on this. Can she give some indication that we will have discussions taking place on the report, give us a timetable on that, and what the likely progress would be, and not simply wait for the outturn in Scotland? Isn't she aware that if we move ourselves, we would help Scotland rather than hinder them?
I can concur with much of what the Noble Lord says. It's frustrating to have to wait, but we do think it is important to wait for the outcome of the case in Scotland with the Scottish Whisky Association. I totally agree with him that the admissions to hospital that are alcohol related are absolutely worrying, and that it's now the leading risk factor in ill health for people between the ages of 15 and 49.
Is my noble friend aware of any plans to improve calorie labelling on alcoholic drinks? Experiments I've seen show that if people are aware of the amount of calories they're drinking, they will drink up to 50% less than they plan to otherwise.
Now, I'm not entirely sure whether the government is planning to introduce calorie labelling, and I know there is calorie labelling on some drinks, but certainly I'll have to get back to the Noble Lady because I don't know the answer to it.
Finally, peers have held their first big debate on the government's higher education and research bill. Among other things, it aims to give students more information about who goes to a particular university and what they achieve, and make it easier and quicker for new universities and higher education providers to start up. Opening the debate for the government, Lord Younger reassured peers that standards wouldn't suffer.
Research from the UK Commission for Employment and Skills tells us that nearly half of job vacancies between now and 2024 are expected to be in occupations most likely to employ graduates. So to meet this need, the bill speeds up and streamlines the processes for new providers to enter the market while maintaining the world-class reputation of our higher education institutions. But let me reassure this House, this does not mean and must not mean a lowering of standards. In order to enter the market, become eligible to award its own degrees, and ultimately to call itself a university, a provider must register, pass rigorous entry requirements, and undergo tough scrutiny.
The key to our concerns is that the main focus of the bill is not about promoting scholarship, encouraging research, or a concern for truth, but rather the goal of turning the UK's higher education into an even more competitive, market-driven one at the expense of both quality and the public interest.
A Lib Dem criticised any suggestion that universities could be graded.
Many universities like to hang banners from their estate, proclaiming all sorts of positive statements about themselves. Do we really want to see banners which say this is a gold or silver institution? I guess there won't be many proclaiming bronze status. This will be a terrible message for prospective students and create a very divisive HE sector, which will see the gold standard universities prospering even further, while bronze will become the poor relation.
Today's second reading debate is an opportunity to look at the bill as a whole, and I welcome it. Indeed, one of my regrets is that we did not legislate in the last coalition government as we intended to do, and I am pleased that the government is now grasping that nettle.
The man who'd been in charge of universities towards the end of the last Labour government explained what he'd wanted to do.
A bigger sector, a better and more applied sector, a more equitable sector, and one that was more accountable to its users. It would therefore be churlish for me, I think, not to acknowledge that this bill has similar stated aims. But I was also clear that more does not necessarily mean better in all cases. That's why the government must guard against lower entry standards for new challenger institutions, reducing the quality of Britain's university offer overall. A stack 'em high, sell 'em cheap approach will be hugely retrograde.
Lord Mandelson. And that's it from us for now, but do join me again at the same time tomorrow for another roundup of the day here at Westminster, including the highlights from Prime Minister's questions, when David Liddington will be filling in for Theresa May. But for now, from me, Alicia McCarthy, goodbye.